Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Andrea Pirro, and I'm the director of the Visiting Artist Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I am thrilled to welcome you to today's program featuring Adrienne Maree Brown in conversation with Sekile Nzinga, SAIC's Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. This program is presented in partnership with SAIC's DEI office on the occasion of the school's shared read, Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction from Social Justice Movements, co-edited by Adrienne Maree Brown and Melita Imarisha. Each year, the Visiting Artist Program hosts a variety of public talks by internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars to expand our thinking about contemporary art and culture. We are honored to have Adrienne Maree Brown here with us today to speak with Sekile Nzinga about the motivations and ideas behind her work. Their conversation will be about 45 minutes, and then Sekile will facilitate a few questions from attendees. To post a question, please post it to the Q&A box below, and we'll try to get to as many questions as time allows. Closed captions are available by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Joining Adrienne Maree Brown in conversation is Sekile Nzinga, our inaugural VP for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, whose expertise spans academic, governmental, and not-for-profit sectors. Prior to joining SAIC, she was appointed by Governor Pritzker as Illinois' inaugural Chief Equity Officer. She is a professor of social work and women and gender studies. Her scholarship, teaching, and praxis are grounded in Black feminist theory, collective healing, and reproductive justice. In 2021, Sekile established a Feminist in Residence program at Northwestern's Women's Center to support the creative projects of Chicago-based feminist artist activists. She is a former board chair of the Chicago Abortion Fund and partners with justice-oriented organizations, cultural institutions, and creatives throughout Chicago. It's my pleasure to welcome Sekile Nzinga to introduce Adrienne Maree Brown.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Andrea. It's been a pleasure partnering with VAP this year, and as many of you know, each year, SAIC designates a shared read, as Andrea mentioned, an annual school-wide reading of a text to create a foundational and integrative relearning of things that we have that we need to unlearn, particularly racism in this case, for all members of our community, and to push past our understandings of the world so that we can collectively co-create another world that is more inclusive and more just. I had the pleasure of participating in the final decision-making for this year's book in my first semester last spring, and this is the first time we've actually chosen a fiction book and an anthology. My rationale to choose the book was grounded in our collective possibility, and I also wanted to have an experience of having interrelated but distinct perspectives for us to engage throughout the academic year. I have been teaching and learning from Adrienne Maree Brown's work in my feminist studies classes for years, and I'm really delighted that they are here with us today. I'm assuming that most of us that are on the call here are already super fans of Adrienne and their visionary body of work. But if you're just being introduced to them, please let me share a bit about this force who has come down from the stars to join us today. So Adrienne Maree Brown uses she, they pronouns and is growing a garden of healing ideas informed by decades of movement facilitation, somatics, science fiction scholarship, and doula work. Brown has nurtured Emergent Strategy, pleasure activism, radical imagination, and loving correction as ideas and practices for transformation for all of us. Brown is the New York Times bestselling author, editor, and editor of several published texts, a ritual singer-songwriter, a co-generator of Lineages of Change, a tarot deck, a co-creator and host of How to Survive the End of the World, a podcast with Autumn Brown, and their latest book, Loving Corrections, is now available on AK Press. Brown is the author of so many volumes, many of them which I have here in my office. Fables and Spells collected in new short fiction and poetry. The Journal of Radical Permission with Sonia Marie Taylor. Grievers and Marooners, the first two novellas in her fiction trilogy for the Black Dawn imprint at AK Press. Holding Change, the ways of emergent strategy, facilitation, and meditation. We Will Not Cancel Us and Other Dreams of Transformational Justice. And the New York Times bestseller, Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good. We also can't forget the movement classic, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, that was published also in AK Press in 2017. They are the co-editor of our book that we are engaging today, Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction for Social Justice Movements, and we are so delighted to have you with us. Welcome to Chicago, Adrienne. Let's get into it and begin to connect.
Thank you so much for having me. It's
Of
really
course.
beautiful to get to be in conversation with you, Sekile, and thank you to all of you who have engaged this text and engaged the work over the years. It makes a huge difference. I always feel like I'm finding my people.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, thank you for being with us. I really want to begin by congratulating you on the 10th anniversary of Octavia's Brood. I know it's actually technically 11th, but we're going to say it's been alive for at least a decade. What do you feel has been the impact of the collection over the past decade?
let's see. No, it is 10. It is 10.
Okay, it's 10. It's 10.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know if you were up of.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, 2015. So, yeah, I mean, it's been huge. When we were creating that work together, which took about 5 years of labor, of co-creation, of inviting the stories in. I think we felt like we were on to something, and we were like, there's something really important we need to understand about imagination. And then putting that book out, getting to travel and go to communities and talk about what needs radical imagination, the medicine of radical imagination and visionary fiction in your life. Um, we connected with so many communities that I've then stayed in touch with, so all of the ideas that I've been fomenting over the last decade, emergent strategy, pleasure activism, radical permission, transformative justice, it's like I keep going back and being in relationship with a lot of the same people where I'm like, once you start to imagine the world differently, it feels like you're like in a parallel story to what's happening versus stuck in the story. So, that's one of the big things we talked about with Octavia's Brood is that we were living inside of someone else's imagination of how the world could be. And we deserved a chance to make our own stories as a way to break ourselves out of that limited view of what we could be and who we could be. And once you start thinking outside the boxes that someone else has made for you, all of a sudden it's like, wait, I think I'm a philosopher. I think I have a new idea for the world. And, we call ourselves Octavia's Brood. And I think a lot about Octavia Butler right now as we're living in the times of her parable. And that she was like, I'm thinking outside the box, and I'm thinking outside the box of what we can be and who we can be. And we still draw inspiration from her, that she was like, your imagination is part of what will help you get through the hardest times. So right now, in some ways the book feels more important than it ever has, as a text to be like, oh right, like time is not linear, things move forward and back, and right now we seem to be retrograding quickly through a bunch of values of collective care and loving each other. And we have to remember that we're still imagining ourselves beyond what we've ever reached, like even the things that we're fighting for are like they're like taking away. I'm like, that wasn't even good enough in the first place. So okay, we're going to imagine further, we're going to see ourselves freer, we're going to see ourselves more connected and more powerful. Yeah, so I'm really grateful that the book has been out for 10 years, and I'm grateful that it ties in so clearly still with all the other thinking.
Thank you so much for that.
Mhm.
For me, Octavia's Brood was groundbreaking on several fronts when it was published. And as you said, the staying power has been amazing. I'm going to speak to that in a minute. But I would also like to explore a few areas that particularly stood out for someone who's inspired by what I call the rebellion of the book, right? The first is that there was an expansion of the ways in which we write and think about future-oriented fiction. Can you share, for those of us who are new to this work, who and may be unfamiliar with what you and Walida were really grappling with when you talk about visionary fiction? Like, could you share what that conceptualization means?
Yeah, I really have to give Walida so much credit here for the term, for like naming visionary fiction and helping to create a space, create a place for the conversation we wanted to have. Because at that time, and it's still true today, but at that time, it felt like everything was so compartmentalized into genre, and folks were really gatekeeping a lot of what could count as science fiction, what was hard science fiction, what was speculative fiction, and who gets to tell the story of the future. And one of the things we kept finding was that when we were reading science fiction or things that were supposed to be far off in the future in parallel worlds and other places, that we were still playing out the same old tired tropes and systems, and that we couldn't seem to get ourselves past supremacy. We couldn't seem to get ourselves to a world where we were in right relationship with our planet and things like that. And so we were like, if we are not articulating the kind of world that we want to move towards, it doesn't matter how far in the future we be, the same problems are going to be with us, right? So that became really clear for us, that we were like, what is the world that we're actually longing for? We're longing for a world where everyone has home. We're longing for a world where everyone has education. We're longing for a world where people are not struggling to work and everyone doesn't have to be a business person to survive. We're longing for a world where food is abundant because we live on an abundant planet. So we started to get really clear about that. And we were like, if we want to challenge supremacy thinking, then we have to articulate visions of the future in which supremacy is not necessary for survival, right? And it felt really exciting to start to recognize that. And then I think the other piece for us that was thrilling was who is telling that story. So for that book, we turned to people who were active organizers, not people who were necessarily writers, although some writers did slip in because writers and organizers often overlap, right? And one of the things we realized as we were saying it was all organizing is science fiction, right? It's science fictional. You are looking at the world as it is. You're overlaying with your imagination something that we've never seen. And then you are saying, I think we can go there. The whole map, the whole cartography of what you're doing is inside your head related to a future that you have to then feel like, can I get you to see my dream, right? Organizers go knock door to door to be like, can I get you to see my dream in which you have more freedom and agency and resource and connection than you do now? And coming to those writers and asking them to take the risk of doing fiction, because a lot of them were like, I'm a very serious Marx reading, Malcolm X studying scholar, I can't, so it was so sweet to come to these folks and say, we see your visionary self, and would you explore that a bit? And some of the pieces, I mean, really, I think about them every day, Danny McLean has a piece in there called Homing Instinct, which is about reaching a period of peak oil and where are you going to go live? And right now, I think that's a big question that many of us are facing as we're in this period of fascism and authoritarianism. It's like, well, where are we going to go be? Like, where are you going to land if planes are falling out of the sky and people are being arrested at every border and all that? The circumstances change. And so I keep thinking about like, yeah, what are the considerations for where you want to be for the long haul? Because, we might enter a phase where we can't travel as easily and things like that. My sister's short piece in there, Small and Bright, she's been working on a novel from that. And I'm always like, can I read the next draft? Can I need, there's these stories stay with me basically. But yeah, that's what we were trying to do. And I think, we talked about moving past genre and really helping ourselves be able, say like, we didn't create this whole system of categorizing everything into these little boxes where nothing is supposed to blend or match or meld. We didn't make the world that way, and we didn't make the publishing world that way. And it actually isn't how our imaginations work. Sankofa energy is always there. When we're imagining, we're also drawing on our history. Octavia Butler said, if we don't learn and understand our history, we're doomed to repeat it. So we have to think about that history and project ourselves from the place that we actually have come from into the future. We have to know where are our roots, because that's going to determine what we can grow towards. So that was also really helpful for us to be like, oh, I need to be able to draw on fantasy and speculative fiction and horror. You know, that's one of the things that's happened in the past 10 years is Jordan Peele has gone ham on the
Yeah.
horror tip.
That's-
And I'm so excited because I'm like, yes, maybe horror is the only genre that can adequately speak about the Black experience, you know, or only speak about the Palestinian experience, or only speak about the indigenous or immigrant experience. Like there's some things that are so horrific in real life that maybe there's only the genre of horror and extreme speculation that allows us to be honest about what we're living through. So all of that felt and still feels very exciting to be like, how do you shake up the industry and the infrastructure by which we tell stories now? So.
Thank you for that. I wonder, with regard to visionary fiction, this conceptualization I love. I love that you disrupt and blur and expand. And so, what might it offer fiction and science writers and creatives in this particular moment? You know, what
Yeah.
can they pull from this concept of visionary fiction?
One thing that I experienced when we were working on the text was an invitation to rigor. So
Mm.
Walida, you know, I turned in my original story that I wanted to put in Octavia's Brood, and Walida read it and she came back and she was like, have you clocked the patriarchy in your story? And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm a feminist and I've written this amazing like story in the future and like gender is not even really a thing. And she's like, yeah, but then this character who's a man does this thing and like the woman has no say and like that. And she just like really helped me see. And I was like, I didn't even see that for myself. So it's such a rigorous practice of like, what do I believe? And then if I'm trying to imagine future a future that is shaped by what I believe or troubling the waters of what I believe, then how self-aware do I need to be so that I'm not just repeating the same patterns of dominance and submission and power and privilege. And so it requires you have to really get more rigorous about what your vision actually is. One of the things I realized was often when people had asked me for my vision, I would think of a place or I would try to think of like a governance structure. And what shifted in me was like what I actually feel, where I feel my vision is mostly a feeling. It's like, oh, in my vision of the future, I'm starting to really focus on how I would feel and being like, there's many pathways to get there, but how I would feel is honored in my dignity. How I would feel is safe, and that no aspect of my identity would ever make me unsafe, which is the opposite of how I feel now. Now I feel like almost every aspect of my identity puts me in some danger at being speaking freely, having free speech about the things I am or I believe put me in danger. I'm like in this future that I envision, it would feel safe to just be myself. It would feel possible to not be causing harm to others. It would feel possible that I wouldn't expect harm as um, a constant side effect of any relationship. I would feel at home on the earth. You know,
Mhm.
I wouldn't feel scared to go outside at night. I would feel like this earth holds me and I know how to move in it. So all of that started to become clear for me. And I think that becomes the gift, you know, as writers, it's like, oh, whatever story we're trying to write, are we paying attention to how it feels to be a citizen of that world, to be a person in that story? And, you know, Octavia always challenged us because she was like, once we solve one set of problems, new problems will emerge. That's also the human condition. We are a troubled species. We like to challenge and overthink and rethink and rewind and redo and compete. There's a lot going on. You know, she said our fatal flaw was that we love hierarchy and we have so much intelligence. And so we always use our intelligence to create hierarchy instead of using our intelligence to create collaboration. Um, so I'm like, oh, when we're writing new stories, we have to think about that. Am I perpetuating hierarchy in this story? Am I perpetuating patriarchy? Am I perpetuating capitalism as the only economy that's possible? Or am I rigorously testing and pushing myself to think of other ways of being? And then I think the last thing I'll say on this is once you have pushed yourself to think, to imagine it, you also become responsible for how it shows up in your life and in the life of your organizing and the life of your community work. So once I had written The River, the story that I have in Octavia's Brood, I realized I need to make more room for rage and for direct action in the way that I move, in the way that I move personally. Because I think, you know, I was a little bit on a path of love and light, right? I was like, I have um, I have a big spiritual gift. You know, my ancestors are very present with me. And a lot of times when you receive that, the way people respond to you is like, oh, peace, love, light, you know. And I was like, yeah, but to truly be spiritually awakened in this time, you will feel rage because you're looking at the miracle of the earth and the miracle of the people and the species and seeing all the harm that's happening. And that protective anger energy is going to come up. And so as a writer, by writing that story, I had to call myself into accountability for my own true feelings and longings and the power of all that moving in me. And it's really shaped what I've chosen to pour my energy into. You know, I'm like, when I see people taking direct action and challenging power directly, like I always throw my energy behind that. I always uplift that. I always shine a light on that because I think our rage is really sacred. And I think writing and taking action are two of the safest ways to express it collectively, and be in those conversations. So, you know, but for other people, it was other things. You know, for Walida, there was a vulnerability in her piece about the Black angel that had fallen from heaven. So, you know, everyone had to wrestle. You have to wrestle and be rigorous about who you truly are and what matters to you and how you're going to live. So
I love that. And your water spirit, I love that it was angry. I love that we need to harness that. So I have a question that you actually began to answer in your first response, which was that one of the pieces where I thought the anthology was really innovative was in your decision making to invite people who were not necessarily fiction writers, as you already articulated, and but to make them part of this process and project, you know, activist journal. And, you know, I'm particularly someone who was enamored that when we Abu Jabal, sorry, today's not my day for words.
Mercury's not
Mumia
quite
Abu
retrograde yet.
Jamal, I want to say Kareem Abdul Jabbar. That's how
Oh,
I meant the
beautiful.
Jabbar. So, because I was just talking to him talking about with my son about him earlier today. So that's why they're
Like you were talking to Kareem, girl. Let's hold on.
yeah, but it's their names are crossing me to get today. But we know that he is, you know, currently imprisoned. You know, is considered a political prisoner. And can you tell me more about how you came to this creative process as co-editors to decide that you would be disruptive in this way and invite folks in the ways that you did? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Mumia was a special one because we knew, you know, we knew about his imagination and his interest in science fiction. We had heard about this and we knew that he had been talking and thinking about Star Wars. And and Walida had been doing a lot of political prisoner work where she was going in and out of prisons and really visiting, sitting with some of our longest standing political prisoners and just building relationship, you know. It's so important to remember that they're in there on our behalf, right? They're in there because they were making some sacrifice for us, and their thinking doesn't stop. Their leadership doesn't stop. Their imaginations don't stop. In fact, a lot of times in those spaces where you don't have all the outlets, you don't have all the social media and the connectivity, some of the ways that you are developing are actually, I think, light years ahead of people who are not inside of those systems, right? And I think Mumia is one of those leaders who's so consistently been evolving ahead of everything. So it was really exciting to read his piece on Star Wars and imperialism and just, you know, that he was like, to be like, oh, that's what you're sitting and contemplating on and thinking about. And that's one of the activities too that we ended up coming out. You know, one of the workshops we did as we were book touring was all around helping people think about existing science fictional worlds and fictional worlds and going in and being like, what are the power dynamics in that world? And using it as organizing tool to help people be like, oh, in Star Wars, like who has the least power? Who has the most power? How are they organizing? What about in Lord of the Rings? You know, what is the power dynamic? And could you imagine the orcs organizing and getting liberated or whatever it was, right? And then I think the choice to ask organizers and journalists and people who didn't necessarily see themselves this way, but were doing that work, it led to such fresh content, right? It led to such fresh content because people, the voices that they chose to speak from were often organizer voices that you could really recognize, that you're like, oh, this is a person like I can imagine being in a room with or taking an action with. I can imagine being in relationship with. They're not doing like this massive character development. They're like, I'm writing kind of from me, right? They're actually very intimate pieces. And one of my favorite things I love to tell people about this, because they don't always know, when we invited people to write, most of them were like, I don't know if I can do this. How much do I have to give you? And we're like, maybe 10 pages, something that just like something, just give us a taste of something you're imagining. So many of the writers came back with 40 pages, 50 pages, right? So many came back with like, once they had just cracked the door on what they wanted to imagine, they went so far. And several people have written full books or done other full projects with the starting material that came through that. But it also, for me, it helped me understand, even because I knew early in my life that I was a writer, it helped me understand that even in that way, we can become superior, right? That I'm like, oh, I'm a writer and you're not a writer. And instead of understanding, like, actually, everyone has stories to tell. And there's different ways we're going to tell those stories. But sometimes the freshest work comes from people who are like, I'm not studying this craft. I'm telling you a story from my heart. And so it allowed me to be very humble and be like, yeah, I'm going to write some good things. I'm going to write some not good things. I'll keep honing my craft. And my craft is not just what I put on the page, it's also my thinking. And all of these organizers are the sharpest thinkers. Organizers in general, they're solution-oriented people, right? They're willing to look at reality and say, I'm going to take a chance on shaping that. So I think there's such I think they're the true gold and the true diamonds of the world. That the biggest treasure of the world is those who are willing to take on the responsibility of loving it and changing it. And so, yeah, I love that we have them and in conversation with each other like that. And Mumia, I'll just say quickly on how we did the Mumia piece. We had an organizer who was going in, visiting with Mumia, getting drafts during the visit of these like legal paper, yellow legal paper drafts, bringing that back, us doing an edit on the drafts, and not editing, you don't do a big edit on Mumia, but just sitting back like, here's some thoughts, questions, whatever, and going back and forth in that way to be able to allow that publishing process to happen. And it's really difficult. I wanted to do another anthology that's just publishing people who are currently incarcerated, talking about their organizing inside. And but it's like a logistical task. It's really difficult, and it's difficult on purpose, right? The government doesn't want us to hear the voices of these people who, based on our 13th Amendment, are still allowed to be enslaved in this country, right? And so thinking about that, that's like what we're really trying to do is uplift the voice of the enslaved in the current paradigm. And of course, as always with slaves, those who are enslaved, people don't want them to read or write or have anything to say, but they have so much to say. They have so much leadership to offer us. So being able to do that with Mumia felt like, hopefully opening the door for more people to be like, who else could I be learning from that's currently incarcerated? So.
Thank you for that. And Mumia, I think, was already a writer. And so, but I feel like in this opportunity, you gave all of these folks what you referred to in one of your latest books, radical permission to and so I feel like there was a radical to dream and to go beyond the current moment. And that's what was really fascinating, exciting to see him write about Star Wars and so, to see all of them go in a different direction. It was truly beautiful. And I don't know, your term radical permission came up for me over and over again when I thought about how you engage them,
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things. I got to work with Sonia Renee Taylor on that project of radical permission. We did an institute, which actually, I think I can say this now. I'll tell y'all, but we had it with the folks who originally published it, and then they shut down that program. And so we've been like trying to figure out like where else can we host this, because we have all this gorgeous content. But we're partnering with a group called the Embodiment Institute, and we're going to house it there. We're going to make it available to everyone again, along with the journals for that. But yeah, that idea, so much of fiction writing and so much of imagining the future is giving yourself permission to reclaim the power to co-create the world, right? Mm-hmm. And that it's like there's any imposter syndrome that people feel, any insecurity people feel about getting to shape the world. I'm like, just look around at who's in leadership right now. Do they feel in any way superior to you? Do they feel like they're doing a great job, right? That's what we have with the status quo now with you feeling insecure. So give yourself permission to maybe make a mistake, but at least try. And especially if you think you have a story you need to tell, I'm like, give yourself permission, because that might be the one story that we need. In Octavia's Brood, it always amazes me how different people have a visceral reaction to different stories, which is one of the powers of anthology. It's like everything in here doesn't have to be for you, but something in here might be just for you, right?
Exactly why I chose it.
You know, so I'm like, there's stories in there that like are sort of energetically at odds with each other, but they worked for different readers. And it was really fun to work with Walida as an editor of that, because she did about half of them and I did about half of them. And then we would share with each other, like, here's where I've gotten it to, you know. And I think if you really pay attention, you can even feel those distinctions, right? That I'm like, oh, like there even in worldview, even in politic, right? That I'm like, oh yeah, like some of the stories go towards the more martial and the more violent solution, and some of the stories go towards the more nonviolent or transformative solution. And like I love that juxtaposition as well, because I'm like, yeah, like in our movements, we actually have a spectrum of ways that we think change can happen. And we actually have to give ourselves permission to have all those concurrent ways. Throughout history, change has happened because all those concurrent ways come together in these elegant moments of advance. And the whole time we're fighting with each other, like, that's not the way. It's like the way is all of these ways. It's always all of these ways. And
Thank
yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to go off script a little bit because
Hey.
if you
You're like, I actually
yeah.
have it.
So if you are an SAIC student and you are on this call, please stop by the Cultural Oasis or Sharp 711A, because we have one of these wonderful journals that Adrienne and Sonia wrote, Journal of Radical Permission. So I'm hoping that you stop by, and I'm hoping there's students on the call. Yeah, we're really excited to have them be able to engage with and given themselves radical permission to dream and rebuild. I will have a couple of more questions, and then we're going to take some questions for the audience. You know, many are returning to Octavia Butler's work, particularly her book published in 1993, Parable of the Sower. Some view her science fiction writing as prophetic because many of the inhumane actions and conditions that she wrote about are happening in this current moment. Right. And so in a similar vein, as you're reflecting on your 10-year anniversary of Octavia's Brood, and you've kind of been pulling on this thread a little bit, are there essays or themes in the book that seem to be unfolding in real time right now as well?
Yeah.
You know, how might they, as Butler work often does, show us a way forward, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things that, you know, stories that I'm like,
Time
oh
for my
yeah.
dance. So the lights turned off.
Oh, right, your lights are out. Okay, we just got to do
So
this.
time for our dance, our mid-talk dance. All right.
Like big talk dance. Yeah, so you know, I spoke about Danny's piece, which is called Homing Instinct, where a woman has to figure out like where she's going to choose for home, which feels very relevant right now. There's a story in there by Vagabond that is about someone who is basically put in a mental institution, you know, and they're under someone's thumb, they're under someone's power. And the thing that emerges from them is uncontrollable laughter and joy. And they just start laughing at the whole thing, the whole mess, the whole system. I keep thinking about that right now. Like we're living in a time that is so ludicrous, where things are so outlandish that if you can't also laugh at it a little bit, right? Have that sense of humans are funny. You know, humans are funny. We're tragically funny. We are in these cycles of such silly, silly arguing and silly attempts to have power over each other. And so there's something about being able to laugh in the face of that, where someone wants to break you and you're like, I can't be broken because I still have a sense of humor, which always makes me think of my indigenous kin, because they're always like, yeah, the way we have survived the attempted genocides of our people has been talking story and making each other laugh. And I mean, they're always the funniest folks I'm around. So those stories really stand out to me. I think about Hollow, which feels very relevant right now. So Mia Mingus wrote this story from the perspective of being a disabled organizer. And it's about this planet where basically disabled people are being sent off to this other planet, right? Where as far as the planet that's sending them knows no more life is happening. But what's actually happening is they're landing and they're being incorporated into this entire society that was created by disabled people for disabled people, where everything is accessible and crip friendly. And so I think of this with relationship to COVID, because I'm like, the way we went through the COVID crisis and the way we continue to go through COVID plus neurovirus plus pneumonia plus everything else that's happening, it really is like we're just leaving disabled people behind, sending ourselves, sending the disabled people that they can just go elsewhere. And if people don't have, can't find protection or can't find work that can be COVID safe or whatever, we just don't really care about it. But my hope and the hope of the seed in that story is that disabled people keep turning towards each other and finding ways to build community with each other. That's what I'm doing, in my little enclave in the Carolinas, is just being like, who else still cares about these things and is willing to be in right relationship around them with me. And I've been really sitting with the idea of like right relationship around debilitating illness and virus in collective format has to kind of happen at the community level. When you have a government that doesn't care about you and is willing to dispose, then you have to create these pockets of intense care and mutual care and sharing the building of a, bubble or a pocket or a patchwork, right? So those stories feel really vibrant to me in this moment.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
You are prolific as an author. I don't know, as a writer myself, when I look at, when I was just reading all of your, I'm like, wow, this is, just phenomenal. So thank you for your gifts that you've been giving to us over and over again in many different forms. And so, but, when I think about your books and with regard to transformative justice, whether it's Octavia's Brood, Emergent Strategy, Pleasure Activism, We Will Not Cancel Us, so many, as well as this beautiful journal that we just talked about, how might you invite our community of artists, designers, scholars, practitioners, and educators to engage your work as we all search for strategies for our own collective survival, our own care, collective care, and our own collective healing? Like how might we draw upon your works in that way?
Oh, what a beautiful question. Thank you for that. I mean, I always tell people I really love to write. Like, I'm very blessed because I enjoy the process of writing. And I have writer friends in my life who are like, I hate when you say that. But, I'm just like, it's true for me. It always befuddles me that when I hear from people who are like, yeah, I'm trying to write a book and I'm miserable. And I'm like, wow, like, it's so fun, so I think maybe one of the things I would tell people as they're engaging in my work is to keep in mind that like I enjoyed the process of creating this work for you. And I enjoy the idea of that we're in a conversation with each other that we're going to be in for our whole lives. So I always try to offer my work up as like this is not the rules. This is not the only way, but here's some stuff to seed this into your own thinking and start to notice. I remember reading Krishnamurti the first time and reading in that text is like, don't take my word for it. Try these things out yourself and just see what actually happens. And I feel very much that way. I'm like, don't just take my word for it. Like, try Emergent Strategy, see what it looks like to shift your relationship to change. And if that creates more spaciousness and power and agency and connection in your life, don't just take my word for it. Try having an orgasm a day for a little while and just see what that does for how you view the whole world, right? Don't just take my word for it. Try, actual mediation, try transforming your relationship to conflict. Consider that conflict means you care, that tension means you care, that tension means there's actually diversity and variety and biodivergence, which is what we need to have the healthiest ecosystems. Try changing your relationship to that. And then I try to be very pragmatic. I'm a Virgo sun, Aries rising. So there's a part of me that's like, I want to make sure everything is very clear and actionable. So, Emergent Strategy, I play a lot with the biggest theories that I have put forward, but there's a lot to practice in it. Same thing, like, I feel like there's a real direct line for me from Emergent Strategy to holding change, which is like, okay, so I like these ideas. Here's how I facilitate these ideas. And then We Will Not Cancel Us. Okay, I like these ideas. I'm holding space and people keep beefing with each other. Like, what the, it's like, okay, so how do we truly turn and face the conflicts that are real in our community without disposing of all the people? How do we recognize when the system is using us against each other and turn our attention to fight the system rather than fighting each other? And then that all comes to loving corrections, which is like, we don't have to get to cancellation if we can make these corrections in real time along the way, right? And I also point to, I have a podcast with my sister called How to Survive the End of the World. We just did these 2 episodes where you can literally witness a loving correction moment happen between us, because we were trying to talk about solidarity and we're going in 2 different directions and we're getting really activated. And usually I would be like, okay, cut that. We're not sharing that. But we forgot to turn off the recording. We had our little beef with each other and we landed back in such a beautiful place that we were like, I think we're going to share some of this with people and let them see that even folks who are like, do this all the time, facilitate and mediate all the time, this is what it looks like when we get activated with each other. And, you know, in that moment, I needed her to help me notice and say, I see that you are activated and I can feel it in myself. Can we slow down, take a breath? And you can hear me still being in my head, like, here's everything I'm thinking. And she's like, but what are you feeling? And what's going on? And she just gets me together. And then we have a really beautiful talk. And so, you know, I really want folks to think about, how do you move your idea, you know, formulate your idea as fully as you can, and then think about what are the ways people practice it and what are the ways people model it and how is that happening? That's all the nonfiction stuff. And for the fiction stuff, you know, for me, the fiction is one of the places where I really get to ideate fully. So the Grievers trilogy, to me, it's an emergent strategy trilogy, right? It's really looking at, okay, and I started writing it in 2011, and then COVID hits in 2020. But I always tell people that I'm like, I was writing about this plague that comes and wipes out part of the population in Detroit, because I was living in Detroit, seeing the plague of capitalism wipe out my city and the places that I love. But then I was like, what would be my emergent strategy journey, science fictional journey? And the 3rd book of that trilogy comes out in June. I'm very excited about it, but it feels like I got to fully go through the artistic practice of emergent strategy and imagining it. So that's something else. I'm like, if you're doing a project, at least in your imagination, let it go all the way through. Go all the way through, and then, you know, think about different formats. You know, I feel like one of the ways I'm able to be prolific is that I'm like in community with a lot of people that I'm in conversation with all the time. And so a lot of what I'm offering back out to the world is like, here's some of the best conversations I've been in. And so taking those things more seriously, the conversations you have with your family, your friends, your loved ones, like let all of that infuse your work and your art.
Thank you so much for that gift. It points us in a direction. It allows this work beyond this shared read to continue and manifest in our lives. And so I really thank you for that. Are you feeling ready to open to have some questions from our wonderful audience who has joined us?
Yeah, I'd love that.
Wonderful. So here's the first question, which I think we're all fascinated by your methodology and your praxis. And so in this work, and so one of the questions is, when prompting the writers of Octavia's Brood, what was the prompt, if any? You know, what prompt or question would you ask now?
Yeah. So I believe what we said to people was we asked people to write 10 pages on in a fictional setting that explored how their ideas would play out into the future. So whatever they were working on. And so we were reaching out to people. We're like, you're working on immigration, you're working on environment, you're working on disability justice, you're working on the prison system, you're working on these different things. So we're like, within your work, if it plays out into the future in a way that feels powerful or where something moves, can you give us 10 pages? And what was fascinating, I think we expected people to come back with a little bit more like, it's all amazing, right? And that's not what happened. There was a real maturity in the organizers. You know, they were like, yeah, in the future, we're not going to have fully resolved this, but there will be changes that are representative of the work that we're doing now. But that was just, we tried to keep it as open as possible, right? We're not telling you to make it, you know, one of the big pieces of visionary fiction for us is that it's not utopian or dystopian. but realistic, which is always both. That utopia always sits on top of dystopia. You know, there's someone experiencing dystopia in almost every utopian situation. So we were like, we're not looking for something that's perfect. We're not looking for something that's total apocalyptic horror. We're looking for something that feels compelling and realistic, where you could imagine yourself in that world. And that's what I feel like we got from these writers. And then I think the other piece is we were like, take your critical mind offline for just a little while to at least get the initial draft out, because that's a common trait of those who are trying to change the world, is we tend to be a little perfectionist about it. Like, I've got to get this just right, because we see what happens when things are just wrong, right? And so we're like, I don't want to recreate the problems. I want to do it perfectly. And that can be, you know, perfection is like the mind killer of writing, right? Like, if it's like fear is the mind killer in general, perfection is a way of being scared of mistakes and scared of distinctions that are off the path, right? So one of the things is embracing imperfection, embracing the process of drafting, and just letting all the guidelines, all, you know, taking the bumper rails off and just really letting yourself go wild and make a mistake, and, you know, write the thing that feels most uncomfortable to put on the page, write the thing that feels most subversive to put on the page. You can always edit. You don't always have to share everything you write, you know, but you should at least get it out of you. And that's what happened with the river. I was not expecting that to be a story where the river comes and just wipes out a whole set of people, but that's what the river wanted to do. And she was very clear, and I had to honor that. I'm like, oh yeah, the earth actually has an opinion, and the earth is like, you know, there was just something I felt I understood during that story, that was like, oh, the earth will handle what we don't handle. And I'm like, you know, so that prompt worked for me, where I was like, oh yeah, like if we keep going down this path of gentrification and not attending to the earth eventually has her own thing to say about that. And I was like, oh, I'm so excited that I got to write that story and that I got to receive that method. And in Fables and Spells, which is the collection of additional short stories, there's 2 more stories that feature that water spirit showing up in different ways. So I tell people that, because I'm like, I don't really promote my books. And so a lot of times people are like, I don't even know, girl, you have another book out, what's going on? But I do like to tell people, I'm like, if you like this story, or if you like what was happening there, there's more of it. But yeah, that was the initial prompt. And that's often how I approach my own writing too. It's just like, take off all the guardrails and really write what you actually think and feel. Write what you're actually imagining. And then you can decide what you want to do with that content. I have so much writing that I've never shared and may never share. And I think every writer should have that, buckets and buckets of unused content, because that's how you get the good stuff out.
Thank you for that. And I hope folks who often feel afraid of their own voices feel empowered now to document. So there are tons of questions here, so I'm apologizing in advance, because we have
I'll try to be quick with my answers.
Yeah, no, I'm apologizing to this very activated and engaged audience. I'm excited. The question that jumps to mind that I think is really relevant is, you know, what is your, and I'm reading off on another screen, so sorry if my vision, my eyes are diverted, but what is your recommendation for institutions who are striving towards creating anti-racist environments while also experiencing a limited freedom of speech on our campuses here in the US?
Be subversive. You have to be subversive at this time. So I think we've been in a period where everything could be named, and we could have the title on it, and we could call everything exactly what it was. But we come, almost all of us, and I mean, not just Black people, but people of all human history, right? All of us have survived some level of degradation, oppression at some point in history. And there have been times when whoever we were or whatever we were was not accepted in the mainstream, or was not accepted in its full humanity. And yet we have always found ways, you know. So I live in the Deep South, and I'm like, one of the things we've been saying to each other, especially since this last election, is like, things are bad, but they're not the worst that they've ever been. You know, our memories are long, and there were times when we weren't allowed to read and write, and still we fomented revolution. Still, we made plans. We escaped to freedom. Still, we did our work. We had a lot less resource than we have now, and somehow we found a way. Harriet still managed to bring other people with her. So think about that. Is like, how do you not let yourself be isolated, but think about, who do I bring with me? If you're in a situation, you know, I grew up in a military environment, a military household, And there were different places where my parents were stationed where they couldn't speak the truth about how they felt. It was different environments allow for different levels of open communication, but then the invitations to go underground. And we know a lot about underground. We've been mycelial always. Like there's a part of us that's always in touch with each other and supporting each other. Now, that might all sound metaphorical, but I mean it very practically. So if you are in relationships within your institutions, really be thinking like, do we all understand what we mean by what we're saying? And you can literally use the language in whatever way you want to. Academia always makes me laugh because I'm like, girls, no one understands what y'all saying anyway. So just change the language up, right? If you can't say DEI, say IED, whatever you need to say, right? Figure out the language you're using. I just heard someone the other day say, yeah, we're not allowed to say diversity anymore. So we say variety. We talk about biodivergence, right? And then those are ways that we create these open pathways. And then I think this piece around freedom of speech, I think if you have privilege, this is the time to use your privilege, right? So one of the things that's been so moving to me with the struggle around Palestine has been seeing all of the anti-racist Jewish people, anti-Zionist Jewish people, Ashkenazi Jewish people, white-skinned, blue-eyed Jewish people who've been stepping up and taking leadership with their privilege, right? To say, I'm willing to take action, take a rest, take the risk, to stand in this solidarity and tell the story of what's happening in Palestine alongside Palestinians and everyone else who's taking that risk. And throughout history, that's been an important part of this, is if you have privilege to use it. So right now would be a very good time for people who have class privilege, white skin privilege, and other kinds of privilege, gender privilege, et cetera, to really be activating and using their freedom of speech. You know, what Cory Booker just did, I think was so powerful because he's standing up there as a man in positional power, using that power to have this conversation about the health of so many people. And that's exactly what you need to be doing, practicing the thing. So it doesn't get totally taken away, but understanding that some people are not in that position. When people are trans right now, when people are immigrants right now, when folks are, have only green card status or something else and not full citizenship, like it's a really precarious time. So I keep telling folks, don't get on the backs of those people who are already carrying all of that terror and fear and real risk. Bring your attention to those who have more privilege and ask them to use it. And those who have money, y'all, this is the time for redistribution. Those who are in philanthropic work, who are doing work in philanthropic institutions, which every academic institution is also a philanthropic institution, really be thinking, how do we make sure people are financially okay? If someone is being fired unfairly, how are we going to make sure that they're keeping their heads above water? Don't just let it become a political fight. Make it an economic solution. Become a cooperative-minded people. This is the time for that. So those are some of the things I think we have to be doing right now.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. I have a beautiful question here, and I'm going to read it. It says, Adrienne, can you share some thoughts or suggestions for students who may not necessarily have experience in activism, but want to be part of movement building or art making that lifts up social justice issues? It continues and it says, and how they can start laying that foundation so they feel emboldened to engage through the tools they have and maybe tools they can begin to build.
I love this question.
Me
That is a
too. I thought
question.
thank you for whoever offered that up.
Yeah, I love this question. So, it actually makes me really excited to hear this question because I think that when I use the term organizer, I'm really speaking about like the organized left, or it can also be the organized right. But it's people who are like, I went and developed the skill to do this kind of work, right? And I think one of the things that's happened over the last 20 years is the people who've developed that skill, we've really become somewhat disconnected, from normal people, from people who are not developing that skill. And I think that that's been to our detriment, right? Even though we were doing beautiful work. I'm so proud to look at what we've done around climate, Black Lives Matter, Me Too. There's been some incredible movements over this past period of time. But movements are most relevant when people who don't see themselves as organizers, but are like, I do want to create change, when those folks start taking leadership and getting involved. So the first thing I always tell people is, think about what actually activates you, like not what makes you feel guilty or what other people are telling you to do, but what actually moves you in your core, right? Like I didn't want to necessarily be taking a lot of risks in October of 2023, but I was moved to my core about what was happening in Palestine. And so I had to say something, even though I'm like, I'm not part of any formal organization doing work around that. I'm just an artist and a writer, but my heart gets blasted open by seeing people treated unfairly, seeing children being harmed, all these things. And I was like, I'm legitimately moved. And so I have to get into the conversation. Find what genuinely moves you, and then think about what you can do that you actually will do. My sister and I talk about this a lot in our podcast. Is like, we spend too much time pointing fingers and being like, someone needs to do something, instead of being like, what am I going to do? And who am I going to do it with? Right? What can I do that will be impactful that I will really do? We waste too much time pointing. I'm like, just bring it home and then find your people to do it with. So I used to be a part of this community in Detroit called the Allied Media Conference that would happen every year. And we had this set of principles. We begin by listening, all these good principles. But one of them was, whenever there's a problem, there are already people working on the solution. You're never the first person to notice that shit's fucked up. So when there's people working on the solution, that means there's someone to tie in with that you can already turn to. And you might support in a number of ways. If you're an artist, you might support with your art, right? So you might be like Fabiana Rodriguez is a great example of this as a movement artist, someone who creates a lot of work that just comes from her heart. But then when she's moved by something that's happening in the world, she'll make a poster, donate that poster so that they have a way to visually invite people into the work, right? If you're someone who has resources, you might donate to groups that are doing intervention around ICE raids, right? If you have resources like a home or some land, you might offer that to people who are gathering and doing movement work to have a safe place where they can meet. If you do security culture work, you might offer free trainings to people who are trying to figure out, how do we navigate living in a hyper surveilled world and still needing to be underground or subversive with some of the work and some of the conversations we need to have, right? And then there's other things I've been thinking about lately where I'm like, figure out what you're boycotting and hold the line, right? Every single person who wants to be creating change right now, I think maybe one of the most impactful things we can be doing is withholding our money from those who hate us and investing our money in those who love us and care about us. I personally joined the Amazon and Meta boycotts that happened, and it's been life-changing. I didn't realize, I've always had a critique of these institutions, but I didn't realize how much I was still pouring and investing in them, right? Even though I was like, I don't agree with Bezos at all, but I was still letting his business be the one that delivered so much of my goods to me. It was just kind of default. And everyone has those default places where capitalism has us, by the neck. So think about the boycotts that you can be a part of. Target is feeling really massive impact for so quickly, giving in on the DEI stuff, right? Costco is feeling massive positive impact for holding the line on their DEI stuff. That's because of people who are just people who are like, I'm not in a movement or something. I'm just saying, I don't want to invest in that. And I do want to invest in this. And then, wreck a Tesla. There's all kinds of things that you can do right now that I think are on time. I think if there's anything else there I want to say. And also, if there's a part of you that's like, I do want to be in an organization, or I do want to be doing the work in a more formal way, organizers need us, right? Organizers need that support. So it's never too late to join a group in your community or find a circle of people to sit with and start doing something together.
Thank you so much for that. We're at time, so I want to thank everyone who is on this call for attending this energizing conversation with the beloved Adrienne Maree Brown. I hope that you're all feeling fed. Please do share your feedback. There will be a one last slide after this with the QR code, so I'd love to get your feedback on how you enjoyed today. And I also want to remind students who are online that please stop by our offices to pick up a copy of the Journal of Radical Permission. And please do join I actually have one just commercial. We have a student group called Black at SAIC who's having an event next Friday. So please do join Black at SAIC for the Black Experience. It'll be next Friday. And join us on May 7th for our end of the year celebration, because we will continue to inject joy into all of this work. Thank you again, Adrienne, for joining us, and for everyone who took a lunchtime break to be in connection and community with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for guiding us in this beautiful conversation, Sekile. That was beautiful. And
Thank you.
thank you to everyone who asked questions. The questions are so good. I just was
I
looking through
agree.
them, and I wish we had 4 more hours to get into all of it.
Same.
But thank you
Same.
all. Yeah.
Take care.
Take
Bye-bye.
care of yourselves and keep someone else safe.
I appreciate that. We will.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.